Okay, so once the slide is there, so I'm going to first talk about test automation in general, test automation architecture, make sure that everybody speaks the same terminology, but that's the first goal. And after that, I'm going to introduce you the bi-layer architecture, which is currently the most widespread way of designing test automation. And I'm going to show you an alternative to that. So hopefully you're going to be able to scale your projects much better this way. And of course, I will give you some examples as well. So I originally came up with this concept a little over 9 years ago. And the first time I presented it was on the Hungary Software Testing Forum in 2014. But that wasn't a standalone presentation about this concept. Nowadays, first time I presented it was in 2021. And this time for all of you. So hope that you're going to like this architecture style. Can we move to the next slide? Thanks. So, and spoiler, this is the trial testing architecture. So I can even go home. Nope, just kidding. So of course I will go into details with it as well. But I decided to move this here at the beginning because back in the days when I presented it like last year and this year a couple of times, unfortunately, people couldn't understand some of the slides correctly because they didn't know what the trial architecture consisted of. So I hope this will help in understanding it. So basically 3 layers on the top, all the executable test scripts. In the middle, the business logic layer holds all the application or service dependent libraries. And on the bottom, it's all the core libraries, all your common libraries that can be reused everywhere. So not just inside your team, inside your project, but by others as well. And so first, I'm going to talk about basic terms of test automation. But before I do that, let me ask you a question. And I would like to have a little bit more interaction with you. So what do you think is necessary for a test automation framework to have? What are your requirements when you think about test automation? You can speak up and I will repeat. Reliability, okay, good. Reusable, yeah, same. Independent tests, very good. Applicable, very good. Efficiency, nice. Maybe one more, any? Scalable, perfect. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we can go to the next one. So these are some of my examples. You already mentioned some ideas that I didn't include here. Can be even bigger. So obviously it needs to be able to execute test cases in an automated fashion. So obviously that's one of the first and most important. You need logs, you need reporting, you need to be able to maintain it, and scalability is again very important. It needs to be easy to use as well, so applicable as well. Okay. All right, so next up, the right terms. Why I brought this slide is for me, it's very important that everybody speaks the same language. And unfortunately, when I talk to other test automation engineers, some of them don't know about some of these terms, or they are mixing them up. So let's go from top to bottom. So first, the architecture. You need to make sure that you have a design, right? The diagrams. This is basically what your test automation architecture is going to be. You're going to have a couple of diagrams there. You're going to connect them to each other. And what's very important is that this is just the design. When you talk about architecture, it's not implemented yet. Once you talk about the solution itself, that's the realization, the implementation of the architecture. The architecture provides the blueprint how to create solutions. Now, again, another thing is that people forget to talk about the solution and only focus on the basis, on the base of the solution, the framework, which is understandable. But for test automation, just having a test automation framework in itself is not enough. You need to know where you execute your tests. So environments, the CI/CDs, your configuration management, you might want to integrate to project management and test management tools as well. So all of that is going to build up the solution. In the framework, you are going to have all the executable tests, the test harness, which is going to let you execute those test cases, and all the test libraries, and so on. So this is how test automation looks like. Next up, so the framework layers, again, it's very important that inside the framework, of course, you can just dump in everything. Whether it's going to be maintainable or especially scalable, that's another question. Now, that's why you need to have distinct borders defined by the layers. And some people like to build frameworks with 5, 6 layers, just as you can see on this example as well. Some even brag about having, I have even more layers than you do. I have 7 layers. No, I have 8. In my opinion, that's a little bit overcomplication of framework development. So I believe it can be simplified into 2 or more like 3 layers. And next up, the integration to software systems is again very important aspect of a framework. And where do you do that? Like I already gave you a little bit of spoiler about the trial year testing framework or trial year testing architecture. So you would have the setup, the configuration inside the business logic layer. A little bit more, I'm going to talk about a little bit more about it later, but I already want to show you that you need to think about what you are going to support with your test framework. And typically you would provide a framework for one application or one set of services. But sometimes you might have one framework for testing multiple services, maybe even multiple applications, especially if you think about end-to-end testing. But again, this is debatable. Some people would not agree with me. I know some people might agree with me. Okay, next slide. And this is, so as I mentioned, I prefer to have a separate framework for the separate testing activities. Again, depends. If you are doing end-to-end testing, obviously you would have a separate framework for UI and API testing, but you still need to make sure that you can execute them together. That's why you have a core layer. That's why you would build them upon that same layer. Okay. And now we get to the bilayer testing architecture. And before I go into details with that, I would like to talk about an architecture concept where you don't have any architecture concept. And that is just simple test cases and nothing more. So what happens in there is that, okay, you write your test case, but let's say you use Selenium. So you would define your driver, the capabilities of that driver, and so on. Maybe you want some logging as well, etc., etc. Now, whenever you create a new test case, you would have to copy paste all of that. Obviously, we are in 2022, so luckily that's not a conversation anymore, or hopefully that's not a conversation anymore. But actually, this is not bad at all times. Like if there's a project where nobody understands how to do test automation, they don't have a coding background, they won't know how to build frameworks, and they only have a couple of test cases to automate, then it's fine, especially if they don't have to maintain it, then it's fine. Another example is when you have a POC to do, and let me give you an example. So 4 years ago, I worked in London for 2 months, and then I went back to Budapest and continued my work there. And what happened was that I had to support 2 iOS applications with my testing activities. And obviously, I didn't want to do all the testing manually. Some of them had to be done manually, but I still wanted to make sure that I don't have to do everything over and over in a manual fashion. So what happened, I tried 2 tools. One of them is Appium. The other one was Apple's iOS not iOS UI automation, because by that time it was deprecated. So it was XCTest UI library. So I actually preferred, and the developers also preferred, to use XCTest UI library because they already knew XCTest itself. But the thing was, I did a POC with two, and we chose Appium. The reason why we chose Appium is because there was the fingerprint logins, a touch ID login. And at that time, we weren't able to do that with XCTest UI library. But Appium had that capability to mock that, to fake that touch ID. And because of that, we were able to register and log into that system. So we had to go with Appium. Now, when I did the POC, I didn't need to build the whole framework. Like, it didn't make sense. I just wanted to prove that I'm able to register and log in. That was my only reason to do test automation at that time. I did it with both. We selected the tool. And after that, I was able to reuse that as my first test case and start building my framework. But anyway, in all other cases, this is what I call the big mess. So obviously, it's not really a useful approach in the long run. I guess the screen is a little bit smaller. So I actually had a little bit longer phase 30-something years ago. On the right side, on the left side, it's my godson. Okay, next up, the bilayer approach. This is currently which is the most widespread. And actually, I'm here to make sure that all of you are not using it in the long term. I don't say that you have to change immediately, because actually sometimes it's a good approach. And if it's already working well for you for what you're doing right now, then don't change to a tri-layer architecture just because I told you. Change to it if it's necessary, but later on I will tell you why it's necessary. Anyway, so it's already good, it's already maintainable. It's a structured way of organizing your test cases and test libraries. So that's all good. Actually, in many cases, it's enough, but it's not scalable. If you, for example, start working on a test automation project, and then another colleague of yours who is working on an absolutely different project with a different system, but still, let's say both of you want to do UI test automation, and he or she wants to save a couple of weeks of work of creating a framework, let's say using Selenium, then this is something that you would be able to help him or her had you created a third layer. And that's why my face looks like this whenever I hear that someone is still following the bilayer approach. That's why I'm here to make sure that we don't, well, actually I like this puppy, but let's hope that we don't have to see this puppy so sad in the future. Okay, and we are at the tri-layer architecture. Let me take a little bit of water, which will also give you some room for questions. Are there any questions already? If no, just take notes, and at the end of the session, you will have your chances to ask questions. All right, so next up, you have already seen a spoiler of it. So this is the tri-layer testing architecture. And obviously, it consists of 3 layers. And I will go into details with the first one now. That's the test scripts layer. And basically, it's very simple. You only have your test scripts here, nothing else. It's that simple. But, and yeah, I mentioned test suites as well. I think it's not that important to mention anymore, because now with tagging, you can create test suites very easily. Like maybe 10 years ago, we created folders for the different test suites. That's not the approach anymore. But if you want to do that, go ahead and do so. Next up, the business logic layer. This is where you have all the application or service dependent libraries, test libraries. Now, what it means that if you're working on a project, you would have some, let's say, validations, which are specific to your project, obviously, because you want to validate certain steps. like certain actions in those steps. So those are going to be application or service dependent, which if I'm working on another project, I'm not going to be able to reuse those. I don't need them. Maybe as an example, I can look at them and I see how you build up your business logic layer, but that's all there is for me. And that's why we have the last layer, the core libraries layer, which is all about application and service independency. Anything that you have here can be reused by others as well. And if let's say one of you have already built an awesome Android test automation framework, and I approach you that, hey, could you please give me your solution? And if you built it with the trial you're testing within your mind, you would say yes right away. Here's Peter, take it from me. Or here's this repository, like you can already have it as a dependency. That's all you need to do. I'm just a user of that library or set of libraries. So what this means, and let me give you some examples. So, for example, in UI test automation, you would have a base page, which only allows you to basically set up the driver, like making sure that you have a structure for how a page will look like. Now, in the business logic layer, you are actually going to have your page models there. That's the actual implementations with all the login page, main page, profile page, and so on. Or you would have a base test, and depending on how you build it up, again, depends on what you prefer, how do you typically create your frameworks. Maybe you would have an app-specific base test, or you would have an app-specific flow model, and from that, you would create your test cases. Again, I know now that I'm just talking about it, it's still a little bit more difficult to see it and understand it, but I will give you some more examples later to make it clearer. Again, you would have some of the project specific, you could, not necessarily would, but you could have some of the project specific libraries in here, which are common or through the project, but is not shared with other projects. Again, I will give you some more examples for that as well. So to again repeat the third or fourth slide, the top one, the test scripts are only going to hold all the executable test cases. Inside the middle layer, the business logic layer, everything is dependent on the product that you are testing. On the bottom layer, everything is independent and can be shared with other teams, other projects, or even maybe outside your company if you go open source. Okay, how clear was it so far? Are there any questions? Okay. All right, then let me go to the first example. And this is actually very similar to what happened to me in 2014, I think, or at the end of 2013. I think it was 14. So one of my, so let me slow down. I want to say too many things at the same time. So I started working on a project. And what happened, I created a solution. So let's have this as an example as an Android test automation framework for UI testing. So I created my solution with in my mind that, okay, I will be able to reuse the components later on because I knew that there was another product that I would have to test with my automated solution. So what happened next up is I built another framework on top of the core libraries, the very same libraries that I have already created for the first team. So I already saved a couple of weeks of work for myself and for the whole project and for the client as well. So everybody wants something. Okay, so that was good for me. But eventually what happened was one of my colleagues who was working on another project asked me, hey, Peter, I heard that you had a pretty awesome test automation solution, mobile test automation solution. Could you please share it with me? And I said, yes, here it is. I was able to do that right away. I didn't have to weed out all the application specific logic from there. I was able to do that immediately, give it to him. And he was able to start working on it right away. Of course, I still needed to explain some stuff to him, showing like how I built my frameworks. So those were basically the examples. The business logic and the test scripts are showing you the examples how to build a framework on top of the core libraries. And if we step a little bit even further, you could imagine such a situation that, let's say you have that first project, there are some libraries that we share within our project. For example, alerts. So let's say there are some pop-ups that pop up alerting you of some action. And that's specific to the application. So our developers built the application in a way that those alerts are going to pop up in certain situations, which is not going to happen, obviously, in this project for their team. So we didn't have to share those. Or it's a fitness application, and we were able to share ways of mocking gadgets, let's say stride sensors that you would put on your shoes, or heart rate monitors that you would put all over your chest. And this is something that if you want to be effectively testing, you wouldn't do a half marathon run. It's quite healthy, but even for a good runner, probably it takes run 2 hours. So actually, this is a true story. One of my colleagues did that. And when he arrived, our test manager just asked him, hey, can you do it again, like right now? And his answer wasn't too nice. Anyway, so getting back, so obviously you would like to save those 2 hours and fake that actual running. This is something that we would share on our project. Or let's say that there's a payment service that you could use. And maybe these are working, like one of them is working for a financial institute, the other one is working for an online gaming company, but they are using the very same way of payment, like mocking the card activities, because you don't need to know what's going inside there. It's very complex, by the way, but you just want to make sure that the payment happens, like obviously not for real, but faking it. So both of those projects are going to be relying on those same way of payment, whereas these projects don't need them at all. So this is how you could organize the different kind of projects and sharing knowledge or sharing library between those projects. Now, how is it actually done in a practical way? Because now I talked about it, but okay, where do you store those libraries and how do you share it? 10 years ago, what we did, we just created jar files and sent it to each other. Obviously, now we wouldn't say it as professional. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to do it, but 10 years ago or 8 years ago, that's how we did it. And especially as we were using Ant on one project, another one, Maven, then a third project, later on switched over to Gradle. So that was a little bit more difficult. But now, the great thing is that even if you are using Maven or Gradle, most projects are hopefully already using some of these more modern ways of building applications and dependency management. Now, what you can do is you can have your core library internally or as an open source tool, and you can have it as a dependency. So you are basically going to use that as kind of a service, as a test automation service. And you're going to leverage that for building frameworks. Just like, think about it, like Selenium. You don't, like some people might be contributors to Selenium, but most of us don't necessarily do that. We just use Selenium as a tool for building UI test automation frameworks. So if you think about it, like, okay, I wrote new external. I know Selenium is not necessarily a good example for new, but we can say, let's say Playwright. So let's say you want to switch from Selenium to Playwright. Now you would be able to hook that into your core libraries as an external dependency. And some projects would still keep to Selenium, some projects would already be able to start leveraging Playwright. Or let's say that on one of the projects, the aforementioned payment system, they didn't have that marking yet, and they are pretty much stuck because, like, let's say 80% of their test cases are reliant on payment. Now they created a module for that, or 2 modules to do that, to cover those, to be able to actually do the testing for those scenarios as well. So you would be only using those inside these projects. You wouldn't share it with everyone yet. And that's a decision in your organization, whether you're going to make that part of your core libraries or not. That's actually a good question. Like, I don't think there's an actual yes or right for that, yes or no for that. Depends on if you include that. Though if you include too many libraries in your core libraries that not everyone is going to be using, then I don't think that's the right way to do. That's my opinion, so I wouldn't include them. Okay. And I already mentioned that, let's say you want to use a new based tool for UI test automation, or in this case, switch from JUnit 4 to JUnit 5. You can do that. And there are 2 ways to, you can go. So again, it depends on how many teams are signing up to using your core libraries. If there's just a couple of teams, that maybe all of you can switch over to JUnit 5 immediately and just change it in the core libraries. But if for any reasons, like let's say you have 1,000 test cases and it takes some time for you to adapt to the new version, then you wouldn't change right away. And the teams who are able to do that, they would make that change in their business logic layer. So this way, they are already using the newer version. And once it's updated for the core libraries as well, they can remove that from the business logic layer. So this is how you can modernize your projects, your test automation projects. You don't have to worry about how it's going to affect the others. Of course, I don't say you don't have to, because once you do that change for everyone, you have to, but you can do it in increments. And that's a really neat way to handle it. And now that I'm talking about it, if it's just a smaller organization or a smaller amount of teams who are leveraging the core libraries, probably you can just simply have conversations about it. This way, together, you can maintain the core libraries. But if it's used by dozens of teams, or maybe even hundreds of teams, now there you have to establish a core team who are going to be responsible for maintaining the whole solution. Even if all the teams are responsible for giving back and whatever can be moved to the core libraries, there needs to be a pull request created. You need to make sure that someone is, or a couple of people are responsible for reviewing what's being put into the core libraries. So that's very important to mention here as well. Okay. I think it did not switch. Okay, let's hope it will. Okay, so next up. So again, going back to the example where you as one test automation engineer are responsible for 2 different applications. So how it would look like is basically, so you have these core libraries. Obviously, there would be more than this, but this is just some of those, some of the examples. And you would create your run app, and I have 2 applications, so run app and fit app. I think that's how I call them. So you would create your own base page, the run app base page, leveraging the base page over here in the core libraries. Now, with the user actions, what you would do, you would have your flow models where you have all your test steps and all the more complex user scenarios, user journeys, that eventually you will call from the test scripts to make sure that you only communicate with that library, and it is easier for the testers to create test cases. Now, of course, that's again another topic, how to create flow models and page models, but I'm not going to go into details with those. Okay, then any configurations like CI/CD configurations, reporting configurations, what is the tool that you're going to use? Again, let's say that everybody is going to use report portal. Okay, great, but you still have to configure it for yourself. That would happen in the business logic layer. And one example that I have as a link at the end, so if I'm correct, all of the slides are shared, right? Are going to be great. So all the slides are going to be shared, so you will be able to click on that one. And actually, this is an example project for the flow model concept, not for the tri layer. So it's not necessarily the best ever example for how to build it with the tri layer testing concept in mind, but I already leveraged that here, so it will give you some ideas how to do that. So these are just two screenshots. It's a Java project, very simplified project. So I hope that in case you want to see a coding example, that it will help you get started. That's perfect, because I'm going to summary now. All right. So as I mentioned, the tri-layer basically provides a more simplified way of designing your solution, not the solutions, but the frameworks. And so that's what we really need here, because most people, when I talked with other test automation engineers or architects who designed their frameworks, they go a little bit too complicated with it. You don't have to, especially if you want to present it to people who are not test automation engineers or not test automation architects. You need to make sure that it's understandable even for them. And that's what I also learned when, as a little kid, when I wanted to do some math problems, I always overcomplicated them. And that's why I made mistakes. Once I learned how to simplify everything and have step-by-step definitions, that's when I was successful with my math exercises as well. So that's what I would recommend with test automation as well. And again, if you have common libraries and more people start building it as well, it's not just you anymore, then you have collaboration between all the people who want to have a good test automation solution on their teams and for the whole organization. And this allows you to have a better communication, which is ultimately, I think, one of the most important aspects of software engineering. Even though we are engineers, we are building, we are coding, we are testing, communication is still number one, in my opinion. So basically, that's all I wanted to share today. And I hope the concept was clear, and hope it's going to help you get started with your new test automation solutions. Or if you already have something that you would like to share with others, then it will help you re-architecture your current solution and be able to help other teams accelerate their test automation experience. So thank you very much.
A couple questions. There's a question from Nancy online. She says, it looks like building project framework for the project one and assume other projects will be able to use it. What about if they can't use it? Do you modify the project framework for new projects? What would the cost be if you do that? Okay,
yeah, if you cannot use it right away, the question is why? So is it because there's a technical aspect that doesn't allow you to use that certain tool, for example? Or for the example that I mentioned about, okay, I was trying to use Axitest UI library, and also I was trying to use Appium as well. So let's say that for me, on my project, I'm using Axitest UI library for iOS native applications. And then for your project, you need to fake the finger or the face, so the Touch ID or Face ID. Now you need Appium. So now the question comes, how established is my core libraries? Are you going to be able to leverage anything if you say that you decide to use Appium instead? If the answer is yes, then it makes sense for you to build Appium above my core layers, although probably I wouldn't do that. What I would do instead is start building a new core layer and just taking some of the libraries that you can. And if you want to make sure that it's a little bit more organized, then you could have separate core libraries. One core library, which is built on Exitest UI, the other one built over Appium, and the rest, and the third core library would include, or that third repository would include everything that these two cores would be able to reuse. Again, this is just like I'm trying to quickly come up with some solutions. So probably we would have to sit down and really think it over and actually do a POC on how it would look like. But this is what I would recommend at the first glance.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Any other questions? Or
just to clarify, so this would all be this number of teams would all be using the same tool, same language. First has core library extraction.
That's a good thing that you asked about it, because I didn't mention it on the slides, but it's it's crucial that you use the same language. Yeah, because obviously then it's not going to work. Maybe there's a way of workaround for that, but probably that's not. Maybe with Selenium you could do that, but probably not. That's not necessarily the nicest way to build it. Okay. Any other questions? If not, then I think I actually didn't, because the previous question, I mean, the first question was more like 2 or 3 questions. I didn't answer the cost part. Again, for the cost part, it's like, I won't be able to tell you like it's $1,000 or $10,000 or how much man-hours it is. I think what it would mean is that you would have to sit down, like say that, okay, I built a framework, I have my core libraries, but you are unable to reuse it because I didn't read out everything from the business logic layer. So what I would have to do is I would have to sit down, identify what you are not going to need. So in that case, there's an identification process, and there's the pruning process, which again, depending on how much it is, it will take a couple of hours, couple of days, and then you would have to try whether it's working for you or not. So again, that takes time from me, that takes time from you. So that's how it will look like. Okay.
Well, thank you, everyone. One last question.
One more question.
Maybe business knowledge, have that business knowledge, right? So, trying to write this type of framework with 3 levels, I'm going to actually really keep business logic and business logic people know this logic. And I'm going to write this type.
Okay. So just I'm repeating your question just to make sure that online everybody is hearing it and to make sure that I understood correctly. So what you mean is how to ensure that the business logic is going to hold only the application service dependent logic, nothing that is general. Is that your question? Oh.
So the customer.
Yeah, I think, well, to be honest, again, this is something that I probably won't be able to like come up with the best answer right away, because for me, as I have been using it for more than 9 years, for me, it's an obvious how I do it. But when teaching others how to do it, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to make sure that they understand the boundaries. Basically, what I tell them is, okay, try to make it as general as possible. If there's any, let's say, a URL for a web page or an endpoint or any test data is there as a parameter or property file, it shouldn't be there. So everything that relates to a service or to an application should not be stored in the core layer. Everything that is a test data, everything that is an endpoint, or anything similar, or on a specific. I don't. Okay, let me stop here because otherwise I will overcomplicate it. So I think that's the key here, to make sure that anything that resembles to an application dependency or service dependency is inside the business logic. That would be my answer. Obviously, the teaching or the mentoring process probably would take some time with those who don't understand it right away, and especially for those who are not that experienced in test automation. Mm-hmm. I see. Okay. Well, I think okay, and to repeat it, so if someone knows the business, how do I translate that business knowledge to the person who writes the test case? So the answer to that is, and again, it comes up to the company culture as well. So that business person, is that like the product owner, a business analyst, or is that a developer who has a lot of knowledge about business, or is that a tester who already knows the domain because he or she has been testing that product for a long time now? So if that tester is new, and because of that, that person doesn't understand the domain really well, you still need to make sure that, for example, he or she is going to do exploratory testing. He or she is going to be going to be able to read the specifications, the requirements, if they exist. Hopefully they do. If not, then the person that you mentioned from the business side, is going to have some sessions with this tester. Otherwise, you are not going to have good test case designs. So the test case definition needs to be there. And translating to that to test automation, now again, that's another topic. So either you write your test cases right away thinking that it's going to be automated. So if you have test automation background, then it's going to be easier for you to define the test cases that way. If not, maybe you could go with the BDD style writing gherkins. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of that. And maybe some people will agree with me, some people won't. But in case you are doing an actual BDD and the business is really involved in the whole process, then that can work. If the business is not involved, then you can write it in Gherkin, it's still not going to happen, because the knowledge is what you want to be transferred to the tester.